Hi and welcome to episode 35 of the Page One podcast. I'm Marco.
I'm Tarek.
And I hope you've all had a good week since we last spoke to you. If this is your first Page One podcast, at the Page One podcast we like to try and speak to writers of all kinds, authors, comic book writers, screenwriters, video game writers, to try and find out about their writing process, how they broke into the industry, and to chat to them about their work. We hope you enjoy this episode, and if you do enjoy the episode, it would be great if you could take 10 seconds to give us a rating on Apple Podcasts and leave a quick review. That really helps us shoot up the rankings and keep getting great guests on the podcast. Just like
Christopher Brookmyre, who happens to be this week's guest on the podcast, Marco.
Yes,
indeed. Just in case you weren't aware of that.
Exactly. Yeah, but it's a great chat we had with Chris. He's an award-winning Scottish crime author. He broke through with his acclaimed first book, Quite Ugly, one morning when he was only 26, and we hear how that happened and how that came to be. And since then he's written numerous crime novels, but also he's written in other genres like sci-fi, and we chat about some of those sci-fi books. Like his most recent one was Places in the Darkness, which I think we both really enjoyed when we read it.
Yeah, definitely.
Under the name Ambrose Parry, he's also co-written a series of historical crime novels set in 19th century Edinburgh with his wife, Dr. Marisa Haetzman, and it was really interesting hearing how that came to be and what their writing process is for that, because their writing process was a bit different from other people that we've spoken to who co-write with other people, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, the way they break down the writing of that is completely different in terms of who writes what aspect of the novel. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a different way that we've seen of two people writing a novel together, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, and it definitely works because they're really great books. And we chatted about that and about lots of other stuff with Chris, including how he's a member of the fun-loving crime writers band who are regulars on the book festival scene in the UK, and I think possibly abroad as well. So that's got people like Val McDermott and Mark Billingham, who was a previous guest on the podcast as well. So we chat to him about that and much more. So we'll just get on with the podcast, and we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's show.
See you then.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously. Get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realise it's not just a story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page one.
You were a journalist, I think, before you became an author. So was writing something that you've always enjoyed since you were a kid?
Yeah, really from the age of about 6. I mean, as soon as I could write sentences and paragraphs. I was trying to write stories. I think because I'd always had stories read to me as a child, and then as soon as I could read by myself, I would always be in a corner reading, and it just seemed like a natural progression to try and write. So it was the kind of thing I just always wanted to do. I think though, as a kid, certainly growing up when I grew up, it's very different to now, where you can get in touch with the authors that you read almost instantly. Growing up then, I think you got the impression that authors and people in the arts in general were like aliens that just existed on a completely different plane. Yeah. So it wasn't as if you thought it was a realistic ambition. I would tell myself now, tell people that was my ambition, but ambition and vocation were very different things. So, I mean, I grew up thinking I'd like to write books, but never really been convinced how viable that was.
And so you got into journalism, and then were you writing fiction at that time as well? Was that always something you were doing in the background?
Yeah, I mean, when I say journalism, I worked as a sub-editor,
right? Okay.
For Screen International, which is a cinema trade paper, and when I was a student and I was involved in sort of student newspapers, it was the production side of things that actually appealed to me then. I think it was the early days of desktop publishing, of people using Quark Express, and that appealed to me. I liked the layout side of it. I liked sort of page design and typography. So I was actually driven more to that side, the production side of it, rather than ever wanting to be a reporter. So I suppose there was a distinction between, at work I was mostly rewriting other people's copy, and at home was when I would write fiction. But I always wanted to write fiction, and I did tend to write fiction as a kind of recreational pursuit, but I never went down the short story path. I know a lot of writers, they start writing short stories and sort of graduate in terms of length. I never really was a fan of the short story as a reader. I always liked a novel. So I just started writing novels rather than doing it in stages. So I would do that. I was working in London at the time, at Screen International, and I would write in my spare time, weekends and evenings, and my wife was on call a lot. She would be out, when I say on call, actually, she was just in the hospital for sometimes whole weekends. So there was plenty of time to spare to get on with it. But what I did find was that writing in these wee dribs and drabs, writing in those weekends and evenings, you could get something done, but it didn't. It was kind of unsatisfactory. You had to keep kind of disengaging from it. And when I got the impression that it was something you had to commit to, so that you could be doing nothing but that for days at a time. And I remember, I think I had a lot of time in lieu after working at a film market, and I spent an awful lot of days consecutively writing, and the results of it, the effects of it, were completely different to what I would normally produce, and I realised that's how it had to be. So I moved up to Edinburgh, and I worked freelance for the Evening News sports desk and for the Scotsman, their kind of weekend supplement. And because I was freelance, I was able to take time off. I worked out I could afford to take 2 months just of time to write novels. And so for a couple of years, that's what I did. I would spend 2 months in the spring just writing a novel, and that's how I wrote Quite Ugly One Morning. It was one of the reasons the novel was so tight. It's about 85,000 words, because I had 8 weeks, and you can't spend too long describing the scenery. You've just got to get the story told.
And so how did you manage to break through with that? What was the process there? How did you find your agent and things like that?
Well, actually, I wrote 4 novels before I got one published. So Quite Ugly One Morning was my 4th attempt. And they talk about being break ready. I think that was the thing. I was break ready, and as much as I got my break when it was novel number 4. And that was serendipitous because when I'd submitted the previous novels, obviously I was disappointed that nobody wanted to publish them, but at the same time I wasn't particularly surprised because I wasn't particularly happy with them myself, but I couldn't have told you what it was. I think it took me a while to realise what it was I wasn't writing something that really fitted my own narrative voice. I was trying to write what I thought publishers would publish. So for one thing, I was writing stuff that was very serious, and it hadn't really occurred to me to try and be irreverent and humorous in my fiction. So Quite Ugly One Morning, I just kind of wrote largely for my own amusement, and that's when I felt like I was writing something that it flowed better. And weirdly, when I submitted that, I wasn't thinking, oh, I've cracked it here. It was more like I really didn't care. I was happy enough to have written it. I was quite keen to show it to friends in a way that I wasn't with my previous work, mainly because I wanted to see what they made of the humour or what they made of some of the situations. But the break I got was at the time when I was working at the Scotsman. I was usually subbing the film reviews, and the film reviewer Angus Wolfe-Murray, we got talking because I'd been working for Screen, and he got me to stand in as the film reviewer when he was on holiday. And then I told him I'd written this novel, and he said, well, my cousin's an agent, so I can get her to look at it. But he made it clear that there was no guarantees that she would want to represent me, but he could at least get her to look at it. He did also add that she only took on about 3 new clients a year, so it was, one of our more high-profile clients at the time was Nick Hornby. So I thought this is it's a foot in the door, but it's no more than that. But actually, she took me on as a client, and I thought at that point I was imagining something would happen maybe in about 6 months. But actually, within about a fortnight of her taking me on, I had a deal. Because the difference was that obviously an agent who's got a relationship with several editors, those editors will read what that agent submits. If it's a select submission, it's not someone who's spamming out manuscripts to everybody. And a good agent in that respect also knows which editors will be receptive to which particular type of novel. So she had an auction going for the book, and I got a 2-book deal with Little Brown. That was the summer of 1995. It was 25 years ago this summer.
That's amazing.
And it's quite interesting how you're saying that your 4th book, the one that really managed to break through, was the book that you said, I'm just going to write what I would want to read, or what kind of my own type of book, rather than the book that I think other people want to read. Because I think your early work's very humorous, satirical and stuff, and I think your more recent stuff's kind of, I don't know what the word for it is, mature is the wrong word, but it's kind of it's less in kind of over the top, overt humour. And I wonder that because is that a change in your own tastes as well then?
I think it's a kind of natural progression. If I'm being flippant about it, I always say that the difference is that I don't know everything anymore. When you're I was 26 when I wrote Quite Ugly One Morning, and you are kind of you're sort of full of opinions at that age, and you're less, I suppose, a wee bit less analytical, and I'm quite envious of that writer now because back then I would have a sort of crazy idea and just run with it. And take it into really surreal places. Whereas now, if I had the same idea, I might try to think about how I would render it in a more realistic way, or I'd start thinking through the psychological implications for characters and what have you. And I would end up not writing a book like that.
Yeah.
So it was more a change in me. But also, I think after I wrote maybe like 13 novels that I would have described as kind of irreverent and humorous, and towards the end of that was kind of an apotheosis for me. It was a snowball in hell. I was particularly proud of that book. And having finished it, I then wrote Pandemonium, which was a change of genre really, but there was still a lot of humour in it. But I was reaching that stage where I was thinking, every book I write, I've essentially got to create my own world, because I wasn't writing the real world in a very gritty or recognisable way. I was creating these sort of satirical platforms for writing, and I thought I'd like to sort of take the pressure off and just write about the real world for a change. And I think also in my sort of personal life at the time, my wife's father died suddenly, and we were dealing with bereavement. And so I wanted to write a book that addressed that. So I ended up writing Where the Bodies Are Buried, which is largely about bereavement and about loss and sort of dealing with moving on. And there was occasions when I could have put more humour into it, but I was aware that I didn't want to detract from the tension I was trying to generate in particular scenes. And so some of the kind of throwaway gags that I might have put in there I held back. And that, I suppose I just stayed with that sort of tone for a few books. Mm-hmm. So in subsequent books, when I brought back Parlebane, obviously those books were more serious than the earlier Parlebane novels. There's still a lot of the irreverent remarks from his point of view, but there was less of the overtly sort of bizarre and surreal incidents. And I suppose at that point I was starting to get interested in who he was as a character. He wasn't just a sort of cartoonish figure that I would chuck into stories to create energy and then narrative. He was someone that I became interested in what if he'd been a real person? How would he be dealing with the fallout from the Leveson inquiry, for instance? Yeah. And so I ended up writing a trilogy about Parlebane where I actually, for the first time, I really cared about him. When I was writing about him before, he didn't really have the depth that allowed me to care about him. So I suppose, to give a very long answer to the question, it has been a combination of a maturing in my writing and in my outlook. And so I think I like to think that the 26-year-old me would read what I'm writing now and be quite impressed with it. But at the same time, the 51-year-old me is kind of envious of
the freedom. Yeah.
The freedom and just this sort of sense of complete liberation that I had back then.
And you say you sort of had to create a world with the early Parlebane novels and stuff for that satire, the irreverence to hang. But you've also, I think it's fair to say you're largely known for your crime novels, but you have gone into other genres as well. So, like Places in the Darkness was recently a sci-fi. It was a crime book in there as well, but it was very much a sci-fi book as well. So, is that something that have you enjoyed dabbling in these other genres rather than just sticking with crime? Because I know from other crime writers that we've spoken to, they say that it can be quite difficult to get the freedom really to go out and try these different genres.
I think there was a point round about, must be back in 10 years ago or so, and it suddenly occurred to me that I'd set out to write the type of books that entertained me. So when I was a teenager, I was reading likes of Douglas Adams and James Bond books, Robert Ludlum, and all sort of over-the-top escapist novels, but I wasn't thinking in terms of genre. And suddenly, after about 10 years into my writing career, it suddenly occurred to me that I hadn't set out to be a crime writer, but that's where I was. And so I was asked myself, what is it I would write if I had no expectations from readers or editors, and I thought, well, I'd like to dabble in science fiction, but for me, it always comes from the story. And so with Pandemonium, I'd grown up writing or watching video nasties, as they were known, the sort of early days of home video, which allowed us to watch movies that would otherwise have been closed to us because, for one thing, we were all about 12 or 13. And that was, Pandemonium was kind of my love letter to those. I always wanted to write something that had that energy to it, and also that was about, ironically, at a time when the YA genre was really taking off, I was writing something that actually American YA publishers recoiled in horror from it. I think largely because it was full of teenagers behaving like teenagers actually behave, rather than certainly how Scottish teenagers behave. And it was very liberating just to write something that didn't rely on as a crime plot, but it's still got a mystery plot to it. You've still got some of the same narrative progression, although it did seem to throw a lot of people off of expecting a kind of Scooby-Doo ending, that we did have a sort of rational crime type explanation for what was going on. But I've been very supported by my publishers in that when I've taken these ideas, they've said, yeah, go with it. So when Bedlam came along, it was video game developers that approached me, and the idea of writing it as a novel was just, in a way, it was my way of developing the themes and developing the story in the way that I knew best, and it turned out that proved very helpful for them as a means of getting funding for the game. And my publishers, fortunately, it's Little Brown, and they have a very well-established science fiction imprint in orbit, so they were kind of set up to deal with that. So I've got a different editor for science fiction, and it was actually my editor, Jenny Hill, who suggested writing a crime novel set in space. And I'd had some thoughts down the years about what I'd like to write if I wrote a science fiction novel, and it wasn't going to be sort of aliens and laser guns science fiction. It was something a wee bit more realistic in that respect. You know, I'm sort of I'm trying to avoid saying down to earth because it's literally not that. But it was this space station, and I wanted to create an environment where I could dictate all the rules. And I'd always shied away from writing police procedural novels because other people do it very well, and also other people know a lot about police procedure, and I don't. So I thought, if I wanted to write a police procedural novel, I can write it at a space station where I can tell you what the procedures are. I also wanted to write a buddy cop thriller, but I wanted it to be a female buddy cop thriller. I'm a huge fan all down the years of Shane Black. And Shane Black always kind of likes to write buddy cop stories, and go right back to Lethal Weapon, Last Boy Scout, which I've seen about 20 times, I think. And I wanted to write that, but Shane Black doesn't write women very well, and I wanted a female perspective, especially I think when I was writing about a science fiction story. There's a temptation. I was wary of the danger of making it something very male. So I thought, I'm going to write this sort of female buddy cop thriller about two very different women who essentially are the antithesis of each other morally and philosophically. And I had a certain freedom by setting it on this space station that I didn't have to worry about what the rules were. I didn't have to worry about precedent. I could just have this playground in the sky.
And are you, from the sounds of it, if you don't like writing about police procedure and stuff, I mean, do you spend a lot of time researching things for your novels? Like for Places in Darkness, did you do a lot of research into how the gravity might work on a space station and things like that?
Yeah, weirdly, I mean, I generally don't decide I'm going to write about something and then go and research it. And it tends to be the other way around. I've got an area that I've been reading about because I'm interested, and that sparks an idea for a novel. But with Places in the Darkness, I read lots and lots of stuff about early space exploration, and I read a few autobiographies and memoirs by astronauts. Even though I was going to be writing about something far more in the future, I wanted to start thinking about what some of the practicalities that would have been the kind of foundations upon which something else would be built. And I mean, some of them are very interesting, but a lot of them were terribly worthy and very, very serious. And then I read this book called Riding Rockets by Mike Mullane, and he was part of the space shuttle program. But he was an absolute cowboy. You know, his book's fantastic because it isn't full of the same kind of worthy and sort of slightly self-aggrandizing attitude. And also, a lot of these guys are the best of the best in so many ways, but he was a real adrenaline junkie. He was quite upfront about that. But he was also remarkably candid about how sexist and racist NASA was at the time, and how sexist and racist he was, and his peers as well. And he's just remarkably upfront about this, and it just made for a very different take. You know, it's that sort of, you're always looking for some wee spark that makes you think about it in a way that you're not expecting to. And I think so. Actually, I named a district the sort of red light, really bad behaviour district where everything takes place in Places in the Darkness is called Mullane Street, or Mullane, as a kind of tribute to that. But I mean, I read, obviously there was a lot of stuff about the practicalities of space, and so much of it came down to gravity. The lack of gravity is an absolute pain in the arse. So I thought that's going to be a crucial thing. Let's, obviously, rather than just have a kind of gizmo to say there's a gravity device, I thought about the sort of centripetal gravity forces, things like that. And then obviously, I didn't go into like extreme engineering detail about it. You just take an idea like, well, if you've got a sort of centripetal force to create artificial gravity, what if that force was going to be slightly reduced the closer you got to the centre, and therefore the higher you ascended in a building? And I don't know at all whether that would happen. I just know that it's interesting for the purposes of constructing a story.
But it's good because you have these ideas of, you know, how does gravity work, but then I think what's interesting about Places in the Darkness is that you kind of use them as part of the plot as well. You know, if the gravity goes off, then the scene where everyone gets trapped and someone says, "Oh, we could be here for hours until it gets turned back on again." And it's kind of used as part of the story is to slow people down if they're getting chased, etc. And so I think I quite like that aspect of you've obviously done the research and stuff, but it wasn't just because so many sci-fi novels, it's kind of dry background data. Here's how gravity works. I'm going to spend 2 pages outlining what I've made up in my head because nobody really cares. It had no impact on the story, but I think the way you use the gravity and other scientific devices as part of the actual plot meant you were always interested in reading about it because it had some kind of impact down the road somewhere.
I think that's why I've tended to write books about things that I've already got an interest in, because that way you've come up with ideas for the story that require you to deploy the things you've read about. Yeah. I think what you just described is that thing that you're trying always to avoid, which is where the writer's essentially saying, "I've read a lot about this and now you've read about it." Exactly. So to me, it's this I suppose is what Marisa, my wife, and I we talk about this a lot when we're writing Ambrose Parry, is that there's a wealth of fascinating detail, but you have to justify putting it in there. Yeah. You know, it has to tell you something about the character, or it has to drive the plot. And that was the same with Places in the Darkness. When I was creating this this space station, and there's fun for the reader as the characters explore it and you learn what the rules are culturally and physically. But you can't just describe that stuff. You know, that you have to tell it to the reader in a way that forms part of the story.
Mm-hmm. Well, you touched on Ambrose Parry there, which I was going to ask you about as well, because again, they really bring in that, you know, you're steeped in, I don't know if it's because I live in Edinburgh as well, but you're steeped in that, in the 19th century Edinburgh, and you really feel that throughout the novel. But at the same time, as Tarek was saying there about the sci-fi stuff, it's not something that is dumped on you. It's just there in the background, and it takes you into the story, but you're driven forward by the characters in the story rather than being distracted almost by the city that you're in. How did it come about that you decided to write a book with Marisa then?
Well, it was that Marisa took some time off to do a master's in history. And it was specialising in the history of medicine. And she, as part of that master's, she had to do a dissertation. And she's someone who had no background in the arts and humanities at all. So she was going in fairly cold to a postgraduate degree, surrounded by people who'd just done their undergraduate history degree. And so I remember her saying to me, in order to she said she was sitting in a seminar and it occurred to her that the only way she was going to look impressive among this group was if somebody had a heart attack. And so she was, when it came to her dissertation, she thought, I'm going to go into territory that I know a bit about, so she decided to do a dissertation on James Young Simpson because Marisa was an anaesthetist and she knew that Simpson was arguably the father of anaesthetics as the man who discovered the effects of chloroform. And so when she was researching that, she just kept telling me more and more stories about this guy, not just about his discovery, but even the methods of discovery, the fact that they would all gather around the dinner table after dinner and just sniff things that they had sort of stolen or procured from the university chemistry department. And but that allied to the more sort of warm human elements of the character, that all these stories about how he would go into the old town and deliver babies and not take payment, and also he was a very mischievous individual. He was constantly winding people up, and he had this role at his house, had this role in Edinburgh society, and that any interesting cultural figure coming through would end up getting dragged round there for dinner. And so all this just seems to be like a novel waiting to be written, but nobody had beaten us to it, fortunately. So I said we should turn this into a novel, and it was an idea that we had knocked around for a long time, but we realised it would take ages, that Marisa would have to commit to it. So she did commit to it, and we decided that's what we were going to do. And it took, I think she did about 3 years of research to create this huge body of research that we could draw upon. I remember saying it's going to take several years to write the first book, but because we've got this big body of research, it won't be the case subsequently. But it was also crucial that she wasn't going to just present me with some massive body of research and say, right, I've done this, write a novel. It required her to come up with the story and the characters, because as an anaesthetist, her perspective on this was very different and very informed. She could see where the drama lies, that someone else could look at the same material and not see the stories that she saw. So we decided we'd work on this together, and it took us a long time to work out. I think initially we thought, do you try and come up with a novel that's based on Simpson's life? And then his life was so kind of packed with incident and detail and a lot of tragedy. And we thought, that's hard to render as a novel. And so it evolved into the idea of a novel that he was central to, but not the protagonist. And we kind of took our cue from The West Wing. We were both big fans of The West Wing, and the dynamic there is that Bartlett is at the centre of it all, but he's not the protagonist of The West Wing. It's about the people that are around him. So Marisa came up with the idea of an apprentice to be the protagonist, because that's a reason for you to explain the medicine of the time to the reader. And also then, because it was very much a male world, but a world of obstetrics, you've got these men dictating this world of obstetrics, and she thought we need a woman's perspective on this. And also the class issue is very important. Simpson was someone who'd come from humble beginnings to being very esteemed, but he kind of transcended different levels of Edinburgh society. So we wanted to look at the kind of class implications and how a working class woman would be completely restricted in all her opportunities in terms of education and employment. So it was an idea that just evolved over quite some time, and then took a couple of false starts, and eventually we worked out what we wanted to do with it.
What's the writing process like when you write these books? Because obviously you're writing it together, but does someone take does it sound like someone takes a role of the world building and someone takes a role of the dialogue, or do you kind of do a pass of a chapter back and forth? How does that work?
It's been different for each book. We're working on the third one just now, and it's a constantly evolving process. Initially, Marisa wrote a lot of the sort of medical chapters in the first book, and then I reworked them with regards to the plot that we were coming up with. But she wrote most of the chapters from Sarah's point of view, and I was not so much writing the ones from Sarah's point of view as revising the medical scenes, because only she could write these medical scenes, because she knows where the sort of tension and conflict would lie in these scenes. But what we would do is we would write chapters and generally just swap them over and rewrite each other's material. And what I've noticed as it's gone on is we've kind of essentially started ventriloquising each other. You can tell we're both trying to write. If I'm trying to write, I'm thinking, how would Marisa write this? And she's trying to do the same. So it's becoming. I mean, you can probably tell in the early stages, you'd be able to tell who'd been writing what. But once we've swapped it over for a while, it gets more and more blurred. And it gets to the stage where these times you can't remember who wrote it. I'll say to Marisa, remember you wrote that line, or that was your. She'll say, no, that was your line. And so it's something that does keep evolving. With each book, it's slightly different. With the one we're working on just now, while I was writing the book I've just finished, she was working on this novel. So there was a lot more in the way of sort of plot and the sort of sleuthing element than before. And now I've come on board and, as she always puts it, messed it all up by sort of making the plot a bit more complex and changing a few things. And so we're now working on the writing side of it. But again, we've divided the labour in that I'm writing certain chapters, she's writing others, and then what we'll have to do is kind of catch up with each other. We've done this before, and you realise you're both writing a different part of it, and you have to kind of see, because in terms of the chronology, one of you might be getting ahead of the other. You have to go back and check that everybody knows what they need to know, and that the timelines aren't getting confused.
I heard you say as well that the process of writing it with her has also sort of dripped through into you writing your solo books as well. Is that right? Like with Fallen Angel, I think you said that you discussed that, and that came up with the plot almost in conjunction with Marisa for that as well.
Yeah, I think that I'd learned a lot from just the process of when I would come up with plot ideas for Ambrose Parry. When I tried to explain them to Marisa, stuff that sounded really well-rounded, well-formed in my head, she'd just be sort of staring blankly at me, and that's when it became clear that it's when you try and explain it to someone else, that's when it becomes apparent to you that you've got steps missing in your logic. Yeah. And so that, as an exercise, I'd learned to as a result of that, when I was coming up with a plot for Fallen Angel, we would kind of thrash it out between us, and it meant that I knew a lot more about the plot and the characters before I started the actual writing than I'd ever done with a novel before. So yeah, we did work on that fairly in depth. I mean, I went off and then wrote the novel myself. She stepped away from it at that point, but and it was the same with the book I've just finished, when I was trying to kind of focus on a whole suite of ideas, and again we would just sit down and chat about it, knock it back and forth, and that helped to bring a fairly unfocused kind of miasma of ideas into something a little bit tighter. And
is that something that is new after the Ambrose Parry thing? Did you used to sort of keep the writing to yourself more before that, and then show her once it was done, kind of a thing? Yeah, most of the time I would just go off on my own and work on it on a book, and she would only read it when it was finished. But that wasn't the case right at the beginning. With Quite Ugly One Morning, for instance, the plot was her idea. Right. So she was a wee bit reluctant to take credit for it at the time, because she was working as a doctor in Edinburgh, and a plot involving the doctor killing off all the patients to clear the beds wasn't something she wanted to get too readily associated with. But obviously there was things like, right about that time, I would just plough on with these ideas and see where they took me, but I'd eventually run out of road and get really confused, and then the two of us would go and talk about the plot, and she would help me work it out. So like the end of Not the End of the World, that was all her idea, how that plot resolved itself, and similarly One Fine Day in the Middle of the Night. But then we got sort of busy on other things, and I started just writing the books without so much recourse to Marisa. But then by the time I was writing Black Widow, so much of that came from stories she had told me about herself and her colleagues as women in medicine. So that, I suppose, preceded Ambrose Parry for her start to be involved more closely again with them. I mean, obviously I'd ask her stuff just
for technical reasons, like I'd most infamously asking her about could you abseil down human intestines if you were, in a pinch for being my enemy. And she did actually go and ask a bowel surgeon about this. They said, yeah, they probably would be strong enough to make it a bit stretchy, and also pointed out that as you slid down, you'd be squeezing it, so you'd be firing out the content. So, great, I'll put that in.
And when it comes to working out the plot for these books, right back to the very start, are you someone who does like to sit down and plot these things out before you really put pen to paper, or do you kind of run with it and just see what happens?
It's been both at different times. In the early days, I would just see where the ideas took me, although I would know what in terms of plot, I'd know what the villain was up to, what was ultimately to be revealed. But I wouldn't know how I was going to get there. And with a book like, for instance, All Fun and Games Till Somebody Loses an Eye, it was all about the concept and taking this grandmother who's from a fairly normal suburban environment and putting her in this world of espionage. That just kind of got bigger and bigger, longer and longer, because there was so many things I could do with the situation. So it was less plot driven, and there was a point at which I thought, right, I do need to try and control this and bring it back to a head. But some novels I would need to know a lot before I started. Sacred Art of Stealing, because it's about stage magic and it is all ultimately about illusion. One of the keys to stage magic, they say, is you don't take the stage until all the pieces are in place. So that's kind of what I had to know a lot about what was going to happen in that book before I wrote page one. Mm-hmm. And so there's a line in the book where someone says, you won't know anything until you know everything. So that's kind of it. That's served me well with certain types of book. In a book like Black Widow, I had to know huge amounts of that, because I knew that it was all a lot of it was going to be predicated on a twist. So I don't like a twist that's just new information. I think a good twist changes the meaning of everything that you've already encountered. So to do that, you have to be aware of what that twist is. And on every page, you have to think, how is this going to affect the reader's perception if they go back and read it again, for instance, or how does it change the information? So some novels you need to know everything before you write page one, and other novels you can just think, well, let's see where it goes.
Mm-hmm. And are you someone that does, do you do a lot of drafts, or do you revise sort of assiduously as you're going along?
Yeah, I think I do tend to think about it and edit as I go. And the longer I work with an editor, the more I start to anticipate what the editor's going to tell me to change. So rather than just submit it and hope for the best, there's times when I think, I already know my editor's going to say that needs to be revised, and that needs to go, or that needs to be changed to something a bit more speedy or pacey. So rather than wait, I just tend to try and do that on the hoof. There's always going to be subsequent drafts, but I'm not someone who just rattles it out and then tries to correct it in the second draft. But I tend to fairly polished first draft. I'm not going to submit it until I'm pretty happy with it.
I was just going to ask, with the impact of or whether there has been any impact of what's going on at the moment with the lockdown and things like that. We've spoken to some writers that have said that they've actually found it hard to be creative and concentrate with all of this going on, whereas others seem to have been able to sort of cocoon themselves and drive things forward. So we just wondered how you were finding it.
Well, I was fortunate in that by the time lockdown started, we essentially, because Marissa's a doctor and she was tearing her hair out that they weren't locking down weeks before, we essentially locked down ourselves a week or so before the official lockdown. And at that point, I was in the kind of closing straits of a book. So I think the first 3 or 4 weeks of lockdown was just me working on that book. And that was very distracting. You can just lose yourself and forget about everything else because you're at that stage of a novel. It's so much easier to concentrate on it. You know, you're quite consumed by it. The start of a novel is a very different thing, and so I'd have the luxury of a few months between projects, but we had as a deadline that for the Ambrose Parry book, we both knew we were always going to have to kind of press on with it quite quickly. So I didn't really get much of. Everyone was talking about filling their days or trying to fill their days watching Netflix, playing video games, whatever. I was just really having to go straight into this Ambrose Parry book, but it was more about getting my head around the story and the themes, which involved a lot of using my daily walk allocation, you know, to go and think about it. But it's not the most conducive time. I mean, as a writer, you're fortunate that you don't have to go to a specific place to do your job, and that's all easier than it could have been if you were doing some other job. But Marisa put it well. She said they say it's like the wolves are circling, you know, and you know they're not there yet, but it's hard to concentrate and take your eye off the wolf. You know? So it's not entirely conducive, but at the same time, we're both very aware that the way to get through this and to have a sense of purpose, you know, is to be getting on with a story. If you're working on a book, it helps give some sort of shape to the week and to the time you're spending. So it took quite a few weeks of getting the storyline mapped out. But now that it has, we are building up a bit of momentum about what we're doing. And I don't think things will change much now, because even though certain restrictions are going to be lifted, for us, we're not really going to be going anywhere. So it will just be much the same. It will be going for walks to think about the story and then sitting at the computer and writing it. Yeah. But I'm sort of oscillating between, I'm very fortunate that I was going into lockdown in that latter stage of a book, but even more fortunate that after that, rather than be presented with the blank page and no idea what the next book was going to be, Marisa had spent the previous 6 months working on research and themes and ideas in the story. So it was more a question of taking that and developing it. So I didn't have to face the creative challenge of trying to come up with something new and interesting and inspiring in the midst of lockdown.
Yeah. And I had to ask that you're part of the fun-loving crime writers band with a whole bunch of other famous writers, and you've played a lot of book festivals and conventions. And is that something that obviously aside, because it's something you would recommend people go to, obviously, of course, but is it something you'd always recommend people go to for that kind of, it's a fun atmosphere, you're mingling with authors in a different format, perhaps you're chatting with people, you're getting advice, insight to stuff?
Oh, book festivals are the thing that I'm missing the most. Marisa and I are both saying this is the one thing that we really are feeling. And it's the time to meet up with old friends and talk to readers, compare notes with your peers, your colleagues. But yeah, the fun-loving crime writers has been that's all the things that are good about a book festival are sort of distilled into that. You know, the chance to see, I suppose, from the reader's point of view, is to see writers in a very different context. Yeah. But for us, it's just the best fun. I mean, it's just been the best perk of this job that I've ever had. And it was really quite heartbreaking. And it would just get all through lockdown, get an alert on my phone from the calendar to tell me where I was meant to be, because we had a whole load of gigs lined up during the spring this year. And we were meant to be curating a day at the Edinburgh Book Festival, where we were going to have various musicians who would be sort of interviewed by us, and then we were going to come up with some kind of grand crossover thing that hadn't quite been nailed down, but we had great plans for it. But
well, it's next year, hopefully.
Another casualty.
Yeah. What was the last film you saw?
Last night we watched Ladies in Black. It was directed by Bruce Beresford. It was on Netflix. was a very strange experience. And we talked about it this morning. It's about a 1959 Australia, Sydney department store. And it's kind of a sort of gentle drama about, I suppose, the positives of immigration. But it was kind of twee. And we were trying to work out why it didn't quite feel right. It was like watching a film that had the aesthetic and feel and sort of visuals of a comedy, but no jokes. So it just didn't quite click.
Yeah. Oh.
Recommendation right there for. And what was the last book you read, Chris?
God, I'm trying to think now. I've just gone completely blank because I read quite a few during lockdown. But I honestly can't remember now that you've asked me that.
It's a lockdown.
I'll tell you the last one that's
stretches into one long day.
That is it, and also it's because I tend not to read fiction when I'm writing fiction, so I've sort of disengaged from fiction a few weeks ago. But I think I read a lot of very striking books during that brief period. So and the one that leaps out just thinking there was Now We Shall Be Entirely Free by Andrew Miller, which was fantastic.
Yeah, I've heard very good.
That might have been the last one I read, but I can't remember.
And last TV show you watched?
I'm trying to think. We finished Better Call Saul, but I'm sure we've watched something else since. We've been watching lots of movies of late somehow. So I'm trying to think what it was we must have finished. Again, I've got completely blank.
No, fair enough.
No, I think we're kind of similar. We've been watching a lot of TV and film stuff, and I find it's really bad. Is that I look back and I'm like, what was the last? I can remember the show I watched like 2 shows ago, but for some reason, I get the same thing when I go to the cinema, and when you come out and you say, well, what trailers did we get before the film started? And you saw 3 or 4 trailers, and at the time you were like, oh, that looks really good, and you cannot remember for the life of you what trailers you got. It's weird.
I think I know what stuck with me that was really good was Unorthodox.
Oh yeah, that's meant to be amazing.
That was excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the very final thing we always end the podcast on is a either or, one or the other question. So just a very quick fire. First thing comes to your head: Rebus or Laidlaw?
Laidlaw.
Okay. TV or cinema?
I'm from Glasgow.
Yeah, you have to. Yeah, exactly. TV or cinema?
Cinema.
Real book or ebook?
Real book.
And
does anybody ever say ebook?
No, I don't know what I would like. I have to say, I'm a ebook fan, but most people are definitely real book.
Although there's a lot of people that do my choice, which is like to have real book, but also have it on ebook if you're traveling or something like that. The combination. Last one. Do you prefer a fancy restaurant or a takeaway?
Right now, a fancy restaurant.
Yeah.
Yet another non-ebook fan.
Yeah, no, you're not doing very well in that.
No, I'm pretty sure I'm the only person who seems to be on the planet who enjoys an ebook over a real book. I don't get the argument of this. People seem to have this argument about the smell of a book.
Oh yeah, I love the smell of a new book.
There's a lot of perverts out there, Marco, yes.
Like I said though, I'm a bit of a cheat because I love ebooks as well because it's so convenient. But we all like to have the smell of a new book, Tarek, but also to have a nice shelf of your favourite books.
Yeah, I do enjoy the shelf. I have to say that everyone likes to have a library of their books now.
Yeah.
That is the one problem is having it on your Kindle. I think is not being able to see it. There's a physical aspect which I do get, but hate that smell.
But I really enjoyed that chat with Chris. I thought it was really interesting, just hearing how he's sort of developed as a writer as well over that period. His first books were definitely much more satirical and irreverent, and they're great books. But his later ones, they still have the sort of certain satirical or irreverent bits, but there's a much more serious story overall, perhaps, is what I would say.
Yeah, it's definitely that kind of, you can see, that those first books, a 26-year-old person compared to someone in the 30s.
Yeah.
You can see the change in that. And I think that's probably quite good for an audience who grows with that person, whose tastes change and mature as they go. It is interesting.
Yeah, because definitely as well, I would say that there is, you can still tell it's Chris Brookmyre from book one to his latest book, but there's a development there that's really interesting to read as well. And I also thought it was interesting what he was saying about twists. I agree entirely that the best twists are the ones that have been laid throughout the novel and shock you when you get there, and suddenly it all falls into place in your own head, rather than some sort of Deus Ex Machina piece of information being put in at the end to cause a
totally.
twist.
I think we've all seen films or read books where a twist comes and it's shocking and you don't see it coming, but there's no way to see it coming. And I think the best twists are the ones where you think, of course, why didn't I see that when that was a clue which I totally missed, or you viewed the film or the book in a different light, knowing the ending. I think those are the best, and they're hard to do because you need to lay the groundwork. But if it's done right, it absolutely is much more satisfying.
Yeah. Well, thanks again to Chris for taking the time to speak to us. As I say, we really enjoyed that chat, and if you've not read any of his books, I would highly recommend picking up pretty much any of them, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, whether you're a crime fan or a sci-fi fan.
They're all great, all the ones that I've read. Who's on next week's podcast?
Next week we have Sheila O'Flanagan, who is an international best-selling author. She's written scores and scores of books in her career, and they've got really strong female characters, really good relationship themes running through them. They're really good reads, and she was a really great chat. She was super nice, lots of really good advice for people. Yeah,
and we chat about how she broke into the industry as usual, and about writing, why it's important for her to write those types of books with a strong female voice. And we chat about her latest book, which is The Women Who Ran Away, which is out soon. So hope you tune in for that episode. Before we go, just wanted to remind you that we do have a competition running at the moment for a couple of signed books from last week's guest, Thomas Welsh. We've got 2 signed copies of Anna and Dreaming, and also you get a copy of our page 1 notebook, which you heard an advert for earlier on in the podcast. It's a writer's notebook divided into sections to try and help you plan your story. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.